Session number 32 of Mark. Mark chapter 7, the 10 verses from 14 through 23. The title, That Which Defiles, That Which Does Not. It's actually the wrap-up to our previous session where Jesus took on the Pharisees and the scribes and told them that they were wrong using their tradition of the elders to bypass the commands of God. So, in our last session, again, the Pharisees implied that the 12 were eating with defiled hands. Why? They had not undergone the ceremonial washing. So in a sense, they were saying they're being unclean in some respect. Either they are unclean because their hands are unclean, or they become unclean because of what they're eating has not been protected by the ceremonial hand washing. Of course, Christ told them that that was wrong. It was not God's intent. Their charge, of course, was based on the oral tradition, the tradition of the elders, the traditions of the fathers, the traditions of the forefathers, whatever term you wish to use to it. It eventually, and after about AD 300 or 400, it began life as the Mishnah, M-I-S-H-N-A-H. It was codified in writing. Up to that time, it had been predominantly oral. But without directly denying their charge, almost as if he was ignoring it, Jesus moved to charge them with invalidating commands of God through the traditions of men. But he's not going to leave that and ignore it. In the next 10 verses, Jesus does answer the Pharisees' charge by setting clear that which renders something morally defective and what does not have any moral effect. The matter, as generally the case, is the external versus the internal. And again, when we see the external, we tend to use the word hypocrite. When we use the term internal, we generally are referring to a true believer in Jesus Christ. Now, in these 10 verses, Jesus is going to begin by regathering the crowd. He had been principally speaking to the Pharisees and scribes, although we're sure there were others around listening. But now he's going to reassemble the crowd to make sure that they have an opportunity to learn the lesson he is about to teach the scribes and the Pharisees. Let's begin in verse 14 of chapter 7. You ready, Jeff? Matthew? Polly? Deanna? You guys hang in there and pay attention now. And that's interesting because that's what Jesus is going to do now. Hey, you guys, come on, gather around. I'm going to teach these guys a lesson. I want you to learn it too. Again, verse 14 of Mark 7. After he called the multitude to him again, In other words, he had originally called them, apparently. He began saying to them, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand." That's pretty much the way the Old Testament prophets began. He said, "Come on, come around, listen, pay attention, try to understand what it is I'm telling you that God is telling you." Jesus wants them to pay careful attention to the argument he's about to make. Verse 15. There is nothing outside the man which going into him can defile him. Now he's using a metaphor of eating here, of course. There's nothing outside. You can't eat anything that will defile you. It just isn't going to happen. Doesn't matter what you eat in terms of being clean or unclean, morally upright or morally corrupt. There's nothing that you can eat that will turn you to the morally corrupt stage. So again, let me start again in verse 15. There's nothing outside the man which going into him can defile him. Food has no ability to defile. That's what he's saying. But the things which proceed out of the man are what defiles the man. Now, Jesus is going to have to do a little talking here, because he talks about food going in. So what's coming out? Well, that's not what he's referring to here. We'll see that in a minute. Verse 16, if any man has ears to hear, let him hear. By the way, many translations do not have verse 16. Why? Because they don't believe it was part of the original manuscript. That it was added by some editor, some scribe, who wanted people to be reinforced in terms of verse 15. So it was an attempt to make verse 15 jump out at you. But most people feel that that wasn't originally part of Mark. So most translations would go from verse 15 to verse 17. What Jesus just said, of course, would cause the Jews to perk up and wonder what's next. By the way, why would that be? Well, there were dietary laws under the Mosaic law, right? And if you violated the dietary laws, you were admitted or committing sin. Jesus has just answered the Pharisees' question of the practice of the 12 eating with unwashed hands. Notice he said if anything going in, whether it's eaten with washed hands or unwashed hands, doesn't matter, it can't defile. And Mark's going to tell us in a bit, Jesus, right at that point, declared all foods clean. Something that Peter in Acts, I have to check it a bit later. I think it's either Acts 10 or Acts 15, but it's probably Acts 10, where Jesus, remember he went to the guy who was a taxidermist, I guess. He went to his house and he had a dream. And this blanket comes down with all kinds of unclean things in it. And he's told to eat. And he said, "Hey, Lord, no way, I ain't going to eat that stuff." And the Lord, he said, and he calls it unclean. The Lord said, don't call something I give you unclean. And so Peter had to learn that that was a metaphor, a parable, if you please, if you want to go that way, to tell Peter that Gentiles are my people too. He just detached, Jesus did, he just detached the dietary laws from any declaration that eating unfoods morally corrupts a man. He said, no, it doesn't. Eating with unwashed hands will not morally corrupt a man either, because whether he puts that food in his mouth with washed or unwashed hands, that food can't possibly defile you. But don't, if we go back again to the question, don't the dietary laws caution against eating defiled, unclean foods? The answer is yes. But what's the purpose for those prohibitions? Is it to prevent moral defilement of a person, or is there another different purpose? If someone under the law ate unclean food, didn't he sin under the law? Yeah, I said that a moment ago too, as well. But the sin was from disobedience to the law. The food itself wasn't culpable. It wasn't the food that caused the problem. It was the mindset of the man that said, I don't have to follow that law. I can do as I please. That was the sin. Had nothing to do with the food itself. It was the act. And the food can't act. Food, whether clean or unclean, has no inherent power to render a man clean or defiled, whether he had washed hands or not. So right there Jesus said, what you're charging my 12 people with, not true. There's no charge there at all. Only a man's internal thoughts, internal plans, or his actions, what his heart will produce, those are the things that defile him. At this point, it seems that Jesus wants to go on and teach his 12 people more about this. So he goes into a house. We're looking at Mark 7:17. And when leaving the multitude, he had entered the house. His disciples questioned him about the parable. And again, most of us, when we look at 15, don't see a parable, but there is a metaphorical connection between eating and becoming corrupt. One of these days, folks, I'm going to not have trouble and stumble like that. Let's look at verses 18 and 19 of Mark 7. He's in the house now, and he's going to speak to his 12. Notice Mark doesn't protect those guys too well. Here's what it says, Jesus speaking, are you so lacking in understanding also? Do you not understand that whatever goes into the man from outside cannot defile him? If you stop and think about that and then extend the metaphor to the eye as well as the mouth and the stomach. What you watch cannot defile you either. Does that mean you will not be defiled if you're watching evil content? No. It isn't the content that defiles, however. It is your heart's response to that. Verse 19, because it does not go into his heart, not directly into his heart. Here he's talking about into his stomach, and then is eliminated. Notice he says you just go to the toilet and you get rid of it. And then Mark is adding here in verse 19, thus he declared all foods clean. And that's not a small matter. How many times did Paul have to write about the difficulty of eating meat that came from the market that processed beef that had been committed and sacrificed to an idol? Remember, he went through that and says, yeah, I can eat this stuff, no sweat. But if I've got somebody there who thinks there's something wrong with it, I have to consider his weakness, because he would call that a weakness. If you did not understand that you can eat beef that's been offered to idols, that's not going to corrupt you by putting it in your belly. Whatever goes into the mouth has no ability itself to create sin. Whether that is clean or not, if it ends the gut and exits harmlessly into the toilet, no harm doing. The difficulty with the eyes, of course, is that it can go directly into your will-making capacity and be a part of your heart. So there is a difference there. But he's talking about things that are taken in like food. But on the other hand, let's go verse 20 now, Mark. He was saying that which proceeds out of the man, that is what defiles a man. Verse 20 repeats the principle of verse 15, by the way, as Jesus begins to wind up his teaching time with the 12. He needs to reinforce what he means so that nobody misunderstands about what he's saying. So he's going to give a couple examples. Not a couple, he's going to give 12 examples. He says in verse 21, we're going to look at 21, first half of 22 at this moment. For from within, out of the heart of men, proceed evil thoughts. And here are some of them: fornications, thefts, murders, adultery, deeds of coveting, and deeds of wickedness. Those nouns that are used for those 6 sins are all plural, and they refer to acts, things that are actually done, motivated by what is in one's heart. Fornications, general illicit sexual acts. Adulteries, illicit sexual acts within marriage. If you were a mathematician, you might tend to say that adulteries are a subset of fornications, a very specific type of fornication. Coveting are acts of avarice and greed. Wickedness are all kinds of evil acts. I didn't read some of them because they're rather obvious. Thefts, murders, for example, were in the list, but they are generally understood, although not necessarily, right? Thefts, people taking, dozen pieces of paper, 8 by 11 sheets to use for some reason, taking those and said, the boss won't miss these. Well, that's theft. Okay. The next, what follows in the second half of verse 22 are 6 singular nouns, and they stem from man's inner evil thoughts, plans, and attitudes. So these are attitudes, thoughts you have, plans you're making that may or may never see the light of day. Verse 22b. As well as, now here are the 6, deceit, sensuality, evil, slander, pride, and foolishness. And we'll take a look. For example, deceit, it's a conniving or a treachery, using non-truth to accomplish some purpose. Sensuality just has to do with how you think. Do you think morally? Do you think immorally? Envy, having an evil eye, it says. You're looking at someone or something and say, I wish, and on. Slander, blasphemy, or bad-mouthing. Pride, haughty, arrogant, or self-centered. Foolishness is as the fool of Psalm 14. And I'm going to give you just the first verse of Psalm 14, talking about the foolish or the fool. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt, because notice where it came from. It says if it comes from the heart and you declare there's no God because you don't want a God, that's a corrupt thought. They have committed abominable deeds. Thoughts generally invoke action, not always because of the fear of the consequences, physical consequences. There is no one who does good, which gets into the statements from Isaiah. You can see it from Romans and other places. No, there's nobody who really does good from the heart only. There's no one who says there's a God and believes that God is good. No, that's the fool. The fool is the one who denies the existence or even the sovereignty of a God. In the heart, one center of being, that's where defilement occurs. It doesn't occur in your eye, it occurs in your heart. It doesn't occur in the belly, it occurs in the heart. And our final verse for today, all these evil things proceed from within, and they are what defile the man. So there you have what does not and cannot defile a person, as well as that which does and will define a person. Anything outside the body that goes into the gut but not the heart has no ability to defile, whether taken with clean hands or unclean hands. That which is evil and comes out of the heart as a product of a heart or will, and there is where defilement occurs. Actually, it isn't what defiles. It defiles only in the sense that you are told that this person is defiled by having those thoughts. Well, in the 23 verses that we've looked at in the last two sessions, they really form a unit. The interaction with the Pharisees and scribes took place in the first 13 or 14 and 13, and now we're using the last 13 to get into Jesus' explanation for the crowd and then for his 12. It says, what you should see in these 23 verses is Jesus freeing, he's making free the human spirit which is dedicated to the service of God. As long as you are dedicated to what God wants, what God plans, then you are freed from these things like unwashed hands eating with washed, and that's garbage. He freed the Christian from the requirements of the bogus traditions of the elders. And in a like manner, he has freed Christians from the ceremonial aspects of Moses' law. Don't get it wrong. The law is not to be ignored by Christians. Jesus left intact the responsibility of keeping the moral aspects of Moses' law. So Christians are under law not to gain salvation, but to live a moral life as a witness to God's saving grace. And notice that something physically corrupt does not automatically morally corrupt. The dietary laws were to do two things. One, show that the Jews were a unique people set aside for God, and two, they were for the health benefits of those same people. Eating corrupting food, eating unclean food, might have physical, medical consequences, and we certainly know that that's possible with food poisoning and so on, but it's not automatically morally corrupt. It takes some work on the part of the individual to make anything become defiled. But on the other hand, ceremonial rites do not clean out corruption. If you go through the washing of the hands, that doesn't make you more moral than someone who does not, because washing their hands in the way the ceremony indicated does nothing for you as a person in terms of your moral conduct. In doing these things, Jesus has declared and proven himself to be superior to the Mosaic law, just as he had in Scripture declared himself Lord of the Sabbath. He's sovereign over the Sabbath. He's sovereign over the law. And he tells you the dietary laws have nothing to do with your defilement or lack of defilement. Might have something to do with your being sick or not sick from food poisoning, but nothing moral. Next, we're going to leave Israel on our next session. We're going to head north into Phoenicia and the region of Tyre and Sidon. While Jesus is doing this principally to teach his 12 specifically and in private, he's going to meet up with a Gentile woman with a daughter who has a serious problem. And she's going to actually beg Jesus to help her with the situation. But now we're going out of Israel. We're going to see how Jesus deals with Gentiles, which is how he deals with us, right? Most of us are pure Gentile. See you then.